In a recent interview I did here in October 2024, I said that there's no such thing as canon in Tolkien, that his ideas were ever evolving. I would like now to spend more than the exactly 5 seconds I was given in that interview to explain what this means. And let me clarify from the start here, I do not back down from that statement in any way, but it needs a little more explanation. In some internet reactions to the interview, I'm quoted as if what I said was that the Tolkien canon doesn't exist, like Tolkien didn't write anything. You know, even clickbait hack journalism is usually less silly than that. Let's discuss this issue seriously for a few minutes, because it's important. First, let's define the word canon, because I think there's a lot of confusion about that. A canon is an authoritative list of works, generally agreed upon by some group of people whose authority to do so is broadly accepted. Note that the determination of a canon is always an assertion of authority. That's a core element of what the word means. For one instance, we can talk about the establishment of the canon of the New Testament, which refers to the decisions made about which early Christian writings were authoritative and which were not. When you're talking about the writings of an old author, you might refer to their canonical works in order to distinguish the works that the author actually wrote from the other works that might be attributed to that author, but for which there's good reason to think that they didn't actually write them. In that case, the canonical works are the legitimate ones and the others are not. Up to a couple decades ago, in my field of literary studies, it was commonplace to talk about the canon of English literature, meaning the agreed-upon classics that formed the sort of Hall of Fame of English lit. In that context, a non-canonical book was, we students were told, a second-class citizen of the world of literature, something second-rate and not as important or worthy of study as the canonical works. My problem is with the application of canon in any of these senses with Tolkien's works. I have heard this a lot lately, especially in the last couple of years since The Rings of Power came out. You also may have heard people talk as if the things Tolkien wrote and the ideas Tolkien had about his subcreation can be divided into two categories: canonical, that is to say authoritative, and non-canonical, non-authoritative writings. For instance, someone says, in the books Tolkien says that the wizards didn't come to Middle-earth until year 1000 of the Third Age. And then someone else says, that's right, but Tolkien also said that the blue wizards came to Middle-earth in the Second Age and played an important role in the struggle with Sauron around the Rings of Power. And then the first person says, well, maybe, but that's not canon. You see what's happened? The person who talks like that is asserting that some writings and ideas of Tolkien are more legitimate, more authoritative, more worthy of consideration than the others. Now, the most popular basis upon which to make this distinction is publication. It seems intuitive, even obvious to many people, that the works published by Tolkien in his lifetime form the Tolkien canon, and that his other writings and ideas, published by his son Christopher after Tolkien's death, are non-canonical. But if you know more than a little bit about Tolkien's own career as a writer, and if you think through things a little more carefully, you can see that this argument doesn't make anything like as much sense as you might have assumed. Let's take a quick glance at Tolkien's career as a writer. Tolkien spent his entire adult life writing, rewriting, and reconsidering his stories about Middle-earth and his ideas about how that whole subcreation works. He wrote the first stories while he was fighting in and recovering from World War I, and he continued working on, rethinking, and rewriting those stories until his death 55 to 60 years later. At several points in those years, some of his stories were published and circulated to the public. At many other points, he was preparing his stories and other material for publication, but his publisher rejected them. At some times, he started to write stories and other material that would have been published, but which he never wrote the ending of. Throughout this long process, which lasted through more years than I have yet lived, Tolkien's ideas about Middle-earth, its creatures, its mythology, its metaphysics, and its history went through many changes. He came up with ideas, tweaked them, developed them further, ran into dilemmas as his larger world-building came together into a more rigorous whole, made changes to try to make everything work, and then in some cases went back or toyed with going back to some of his very first ideas again. Now, if we say that out of all these writings, only the works he published in his lifetime are canon, what does that imply? First, remember that the definition of canon always involves an assertion of authority. If a canon has been established, then some person or group of people has established it, determining authoritatively what is in the canon and what is out. People who claim that the published works are canon will sometimes talk as if by insisting on this, they're giving Tolkien the authority to choose. After all, if he didn't publish something, then he didn't enter it into the official public record, as it were. The problem with this argument is that it completely ignores how publication actually works. Who has authority over the decisions concerning what gets published? It isn't the author. The person who decided which of Tolkien's works would be published was his publisher. Are we really willing to give that guy the absolute authority to decide which of Tolkien's works are legitimate and which are not? What status do we give to the stories that Tolkien wrote and tried to get published but got turned down for? There are a lot of writings which Tolkien would have published if he'd gotten his way, but he often did not get his way. If you want your definition of canon to be based on Tolkien's wishes, then there is no excuse for using the list of published works. I also find that people don't tend to think all the way through the consequences of declaring that only the works published in Tolkien's lifetime are canon. If you do that, then there is no possible justification for considering the Silmarillion to be canon, or Unfinished Tales, or the Children of Húrin, or any of the rest of them. The Silmarillion was published several years after Tolkien's death, based on exactly the writings that most of the people who insist on canon consider non-canonical. All you've got for Middle-earth are pretty much The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, one collection of poems, and one collection of sheet music. Are the people insisting on Tolkien canon really willing to accept this? It never really sounds like it to me, and I think it's a terrible idea. For almost 60 years of Tolkien's life, the Silmarillion was his baby. In my personal opinion, refusing to recognize as legitimate any of his work on what he considered his greatest stories is exactly the opposite of respecting Tolkien's wishes and choices. So, if we can't accept his publication record as his canon, then on what basis are we to decide what's in and what's out? I would maintain that there is no objective basis for making that distinction. Sure, you're welcome to your subjective opinions about it. You can certainly like some of the things he wrote better than others. You can have favorite versions of his stories. There's nothing wrong with that. You can also just stick to The Lord of the Rings and call it a day. There's no shame in that. But it would be much better if people would stop claiming the authority to decide which of Tolkien's thoughts are legit and which aren't. I know that many readers of Tolkien don't like the idea that Tolkien changed his mind, in some cases again and again. But he did. If you're going to make claims about what Tolkien thought, or what Tolkien believed, or if you want to make some broad claim about how things work in Tolkien's world, you can't ignore the fact that Tolkien changed his ideas. You can't ignore that with any integrity anyway. Keep in mind here, the last thing I'm trying to imply is that you have to read and study the whole history of Middle-earth and all of Tolkien's most obscure writings. I am not in any way trying to be a gatekeeper here and say that to be a real Tolkien fan, you have to read and know all that stuff. It's totally fine. You can be a Tolkien fan without reading any of it. But what you can't do with any intellectual integrity is make broad claims about what Tolkien thought if you are in fact ignoring most of the things that Tolkien did in fact think and write down. Now, before I go, I want to address one possible source of confusion about what the word canon means. Many of you will have read or heard quoted Tolkien's Letter 210, in which, while criticizing an awful film screenplay for a Lord of the Rings adaptation, he says that the canons of narrative art in any medium cannot be wholly different. Tolkien is not here using the word canon in the sense we've been discussing. He's using a tertiary sense of the word, which means something like accepted best practices. You could paraphrase the canons of narrative art in any medium cannot be wholly different as something like the best way to tell stories in prose and the best way to tell stories in films cannot be wholly different from each other. It's an interesting discussion and a fascinating letter, but he's here using the word canon in a totally different sense than the one I'm addressing today. One last note. One of the most common uses of the word canon in contemporary discussion is the word headcanon. Headcanon is a quite different thing. That means what you imagine in your own mind about the story. Your headcanon is your own private adaptation of the story, and it usually has to do with your own interpretation or your own filling in of the blanks of the story through your own imagination. And there's nothing wrong with that, any more than there's anything wrong with a film adaptation, making those same kinds of choices and putting them in the movie or TV show. The canon issue has come again and again to my attention through comments I've seen about the Rings of Power, and I expect that issue to come up almost every time a new Tolkien adaptation comes around. The Rings of Power brings this question to the fore all the time because its writers just love all those other writings of Tolkien which some people want to exclude as non-canonical. I think we will all be better served and probably happier if people stop trying to assert arbitrary authority over Tolkien's work and examine the adaptations on their own terms instead and in their full relationship with Tolkien's ideas. Or, leave them if you don't like them, and no blame to you. But let's not sacrifice Tolkien's own thoughts and the work of his whole adult life for the sake of trying to win internet arguments.